Hello, I would like to welcome everyone to the PartSource HTM Leadership Series. Today's presentation is the third of our 7-week series that will continue through November 12th. Today's session, Decision Support Procurement, You Get Quality When You Ask For It, will be presented by Carol Davis-Smith and is hosted by Gina Tweed. Before we begin, I'd like to review a few housekeeping items. First, you have a control panel at the side or bottom of your screen. You can minimize and control this panel. Second, you can submit questions using the question portion of the control panel. We will answer questions at the end of the presentation. If for some reason your question is not answered, we will respond to you individually after the event via email. All registrants will receive a link to the recording of this webinar after the webinar. The information again will be sent to the email address with which you registered. And now please allow me to introduce Gina Tweed, Vice President of Quality Assurance for PartSource. Gina Tweed joined PartSource in 2016. With over 23 years in quality, 16 years in medical devices, focused on product development and supply chain quality. Along with her master's degree in MIS in computer engineering from the University of Illinois and her Six Sigma Master Black Belt certification from GE, Ms. Tweed has also received several awards from GE for outstanding quality service and has been featured in the Society of Women in Engineering magazine as an up-and-coming leader in technology. Now I'll hand it over to you, Gina.
Thank you. Thank you again for joining us today. PartSource value partnership with clients, parts manufacturers, suppliers, service partners, and leaders in the HTM community. The continual goal of this HTM leadership series is to connect HTM leaders to discuss topics that are shaping the future of the HTM. During this webinar series, we will gain valuable insight on how to address some of the healthcare technology management and healthcare supply chain's most pressing challenges, one which being ensuring quality, near and dear to my heart, which industry expert Carol Davis-Smith will highlight today. Carol Davis-Smith is a proven leader in the development and maintenance of safe, reliable, cost-effective, and efficient patient care delivery systems through technology and process management. She is a certified clinical engineer with 30 years of experience in academic and not-for-profit medical centers, group purchasing, consulting, and executive leaders. Throughout her career, Carol has provided support in all areas of healthcare technology lifecycle with specific focus on clinical engineering management and technology assessment. Carol holds a Master's of Science degree in Electrical and Computer Engineering, Clinical Engineering from the University of Arizona, and a Bachelor of Science in Bioengineering Technology from the University of Dayton. She is a fellow in the American College of Clinical Engineering and the Association for the Advancement of Medical Instruments. Before I turn it over to Carol, I'd like to say Carol is a connector. She connects, and as you can see in her 30 years of experience, she connects the right people with the right processes. And what you'll see today in her presentation is that connecting ability. Carol, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Gina and Colleen, for the opportunity to share some of what I've learned over those years. And thank you for that very nice introduction. My mom would be proud. My dad would ask a zillion questions. So, but thank you so very much. Before we jump into this, I thought it might be helpful to share with those of you joining us this morning or afternoon or evening, depending upon what time zone you reside in, a little bit of background, how we got to this session. And it came out of a conversation where I was asked something along the lines of, well, how do we know if we're getting quality, or how do we make sure we get quality? And I said, you ask for it, right? I mean, it seems, as my professors would have said, intuitively obvious, but it's not. I think our assumption is that quality is just going to happen. that's just kind of the way of the world. But unfortunately, the speed of the world and just our human nature, we have to ask for it. We can't just expect it. We have to ask for it. So to help you be able to do that, some of you probably have a lot of experience in this space and just maybe haven't thought about it in the context of quality. Some of you, this is brand new too. So the objectives today are really to help enable you in this space, in this part of your practice, if you will, of healthcare technology management. So we're going to talk a bit about what is quality, make sure we're on the same page, that we understand what we mean when we say quality, and where we're focusing, at least in this particular conversation. We're going to talk about when and how to ask for it, because that's the call to action, right? Don't expect it, ask for it. Or don't just expect it, you must ask for it. And then the step that's all too often forgotten is, how do I measure the value of that quality, right? Why was it important for me to ask for quality in the first place? So this is sort of the roadmap for our journey today. So what is quality? Well, if we look up in the dictionary, it tells us things like a degree of excellence, superiority in kind. It's something better than other things that are similar, right? That are sort of in the same group, if you will. Some organizations that you may have heard of, you may have familiarity with, the National Quality Forum and the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. They have quality in their name, right? So clearly they're looking at quality, but what aspect? They tend to focus on patients, care delivery providers, how we deliver care, what's the outcome of that care, can we do it better, how might we do it better? So they're asking, what does quality look like in that environment, and how do we measure it and how do we do it better? The FDA, everybody on this call should be very familiar with the FDA, and just like its namesake, it's looking for quality in the food and drug areas. But as most of us, probably our interactions are more around medical supplies and medical devices, right? So they're looking at those products, but just like the others, they're looking at the providers, right, of those products. They're looking at the manufacturers and using defining what quality means to them in terms of manufacturers of those products, as well as what does quality look like in the products that they bring to market or want to bring to market. So quality is all around us. It's happening every day, all day. The question becomes, how do we as healthcare technology management professionals participate in the quality discussion? How and when? So that takes us to the next step of our journey. And I would suggest to you that when should you ask for quality is always and for everything, whether it's a product, a service. But don't forget, you also want to ask quality for vendors and suppliers as the provider, if you will, of those products and services. And the how comes in the form of tools that are already in place in your organization, RFIs, RFPs, RFQs. You might have other RF somethings in your organization. But the folks that have probably put many of those tools together are our supply chain colleagues, and potentially your quality department. As they have input, they have the ability to describe what quality could or should look like in the form of products, vendors, and suppliers, right? And then all of that can be captured into these tools that we are or should be very familiar with, these various requests for tools that are used in the acquisition and procurement processes. So let's walk through a few examples that make this a little more real, hopefully. So commodities. So a true commodity is very well understood. Most of the time, the vast majority of commodities tend to be supply items that our supply chain folks and colleagues address on a daily basis. Many of those commodities interact with the medical devices that we are responsible for. So we should take an interest in the commodities and understand that purchase price is probably the primary factor in that acquisition process, but there's certainly a quality component. We certainly want products that work. So we may have reduced the commodities that we're willing to contract for and get that purchase price driver addressed because of meeting particular benchmarks, if you will. So things like perhaps your organization only will buy tubing. Tubing is a great example of a commodity. Will only buy tubing that meets particular chemical component specifications, right? There's certain chemicals out there in tubing and gloves and other sort of plastic, rubber type of products that are known to produce bad outcomes in the users as well as the patients. So you may have limited your commodity stack, and now you're primarily now setting your quality marker at price. Many organizations, and especially if we think in light of the last 8 to 10 months of our lives, are very concerned about the supply chain. How is that commodity going to get to my organization? How is it going to get to my facilities? That's the supply chain. How many sort of steps does it have to go through? That has always been a quality measure, but I can share with you that it is, and even more important, it has been elevated in terms of quality metrics that our supply chain colleagues are using these days to evaluate whether a commodity will be preferred in their organization or not. And then PPE is another great example of what has traditionally been a commodity, but I will also punch out here that under crisis sort of situations, again, the sort of circumstances we've been living in over the last 10 months, even a commodity can become unpredictable in its quality. So I mentioned, so if you're buying, say, the tubing or gloves or even PPE that you had preferred suppliers in the past because of quality metrics you put out there about the construction of the item, you know, it was well manufactured, it was reliable, it didn't fail, it showed up on time, all those sort of things. That may all be out the window under sort of extreme circumstances that we've been living under. But it's important to understand what the foundational quality measures were so that you can make thoughtful strategic adjustments in those quality measures as you ask for, as you're seeking to purchase your commodities. The second example is the one that we're probably most familiar with, which is being involved in the acquisition of clinical technologies, medical devices. Pardon me. And in these cases, we have some guidance documents in terms of an acquisition guide from Amy. But the point here is that it requires many more steps to define what constitutes quality. So we want to look at this from, and in all cases, whether we're looking at commodities or equipment, we really want to look at the situation in terms of the clinical, the technical, and the financial requirements, and then associate the quality measures. So we want a product, a device, a system to do a particular clinical function, in a particular technical environment within some sort of financial parameters. And we measure, we look, we do RFIs to find out which organizations can meet those measures, because those are quality measures, those are functional requirements, but the how they do that becomes very important. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But we all know that when we look at medical devices, there are cases where there is very small difference in how clinical or technical functional requirements are met, and in other cases they're very broad. And so the question becomes, is that going to impact the quality of our ability to deliver care and or to maintain this device in our organization? And we follow through on all of that and those quality impacts. And we're going to come back to this, the total cost of ownership. Having these functional requirements means that we can do particular things in our organization in a quality manner, right? And so we build in deal breakers. And the reason you build in deal breakers is it's sort of that last hurdle, that last way to separate the products and the manufacturers that can meet your expectations, that can differentiate themselves. As we said in the definition of quality, they can provide excellence and they are superior to other options, if you will, in the marketplace. So quality is implied throughout here, but it's making sure that we understand kind of how it fits and that we have expectations. These functional requirements are a way to communicate our expectations of the level of quality and performance that we have of each of these devices. And the value analysis allows us to not only qualitatively measure, but quantitatively measure. So it's an important process to go back to and make sure, again, this is where your RFI and your RFP and your RFQ all get looped into a very well-defined process. And so by using a process such as this, you then add another layer of quality, reproducibility to your organization's ability to bring on board high quality commodity and or equipment items. Now, the third example is the place that lots of organizations drop the ball from a quality perspective and ultimately a financial perspective. And that's by forgetting or overlooking or assuming someone else has determined the quality of your vendors and suppliers. We do a great job of building huge documents around the products, but we often forget to do the same with the folks that are providing those products and services. It's also important to understand that there is a distinction between vendors and suppliers. A vendor tends to be transactional. You buy stuff from them, right? It's not uncommon to have vendors for commodities. However, and sometimes for some of the very simplistic equipment that we buy, we may buy it from vendors. More often than not, and especially if we're on a quality journey and we're really thinking about quality, we're looking for suppliers. Suppliers are strategic. They think about what they do and how they do it within their organization and with and in collaboration, their customers, the people they serve. And so ideally, every organization has a mix of these, but you need to understand, you need to ask enough questions to understand, am I interacting with a vendor or am I interacting with a supplier? And what do I need for the outcome that I seek? So to get there, you have to ask questions. In addition to all those questions we asked about their product, we need to ask questions about their company, their organization. Do they understand their own supply chain? Do they do quality sort of processes and quality measures and requirements in their own supply chain? Do they understand their supply chain downstream to me, their customer, or upstream to all the people that provide the pieces and parts, materials and components and whatnot that come into raw materials that come into my manufacturing facility. Do they understand all of that as an organization? Can they speak to that? Or what we're finding, again, looking at the most recent 8 to 10 months of our lives, what we're finding is that our vendor and supplier organizations are recognizing this value. So it may be that they can speak to, wow, we learned a hard lesson, and here's what we're doing about it. That's a quality statement, unless that statement ends with, and we're doing nothing. But if they're putting things in place that tells you something about the difference between them serving as a traditional vendor, very transactional, versus a supplier who's going to be very strategic in their interactions with you. You're also going to want to look at things like their financial health, their professional services, and their pipeline of technology. You may have asked some of those pipeline questions in the product questionnaire, but you may want to ask a little bit different sort of technology pipeline questions here about the sort of expertise they have in their organization to define a very thoughtful pipeline of technology. And then professional services, again, that's a lot about how do they interact with you? Is it transactional? We'll make sure that we get that sale done efficiently and quickly and concisely with you. Or we're a supplier, we're going to engage with you more strategically. You're going to need assistance in implementation and deployment and ongoing management or whatever it might be. These are all the sort of questions that you want to ask. And in financial health, those are things like you probably heard your finance and supply chain folks talk about whether they're done in Bradstreet rating. They may look at the size of the company. They may look at the spread of the company. Do you have people in your region? Are they national? Are they local? Are they regional? Do they have partners? How are they structured from both an organizational and a financial perspective? And can that support my needs as a consumer? So you can see this vendor piece is just as complicated and just as important as the data and the information you're collecting on the product itself, right? So as implied in some of these photos here, you want to be able to then to begin differentiating between the great partners in terms of vendors, suppliers, and products, and then, well, let's say not so great, right? So we need to understand how do we measure the value that we're getting from these quality questions or these quality assessments, right? In terms of not only what do they do, but how do they do it? And is it giving me the outcome that I'd like to have? Now, where is this data? It better have been asked for and documented in your purchase contract. The data and the quality of the value of quality for both the product, the services, and the vendor-supplier relationship should all be captured inside your procurement contract, right? Incentives, penalties, performance expectations, both of the product and the provider. So that's laying it out in front. And then the retrospective, the ongoing monitoring and measuring should be happening in your CMMS in the form of reliability data, in the form of service documentation of both your in-house and any external resources you're using. What was the mean time between failure, all those sorts of things. And then in the supply chain and finance side, your ERP system, your enterprise resource planning system, should have financial information, it should have reliability information, performance data about the financial and the procurement interactions around those products and those vendors or suppliers. So the data's there, it depends upon how we pull it out. So let's walk through a couple more examples. Products and services. So these are the boxes, right? Or the interactions. These are we want somebody to do something for us. They sold us a product. We want to start again, just like we set up the requirements, we want to measure the quality, did we get quality in terms of those same clinical, technical, and financial terms, right? So the product, a qualitative measure might be something around the functionality of it. We were looking for something that was very mainstream, pretty typical to everyone else, and it is, and that's the way it has performed. So it does the clinical things that we asked for, and the maintenance of it is in line with, or is not in line with, what we would expect from a mainstream device. Or perhaps we asked and contracted and procured some advanced capabilities, right? What does that mean? So that would have been documented in terms of advanced, what is it that separates it from the mainstream, and did we get that, right? We want to be able to qualitatively, yes or no, it's doing it or it's not doing it, sort of measure around that functionality. A more quantitative measure of these boxes and services is to actually do the uptime, downtime measures that we talk about all the time, to be able to have that documentation in that contract. We've said this is how we're going to measure and monitor uptime and or downtime. And we're going to relate it to our ability to diagnose and treat patients. Do we have sufficient available time to do that? Or is this product unavailable too often? Have I incurred costs because I had to delay diagnosis or treatment? Or worst case, I had to divert patients to somewhere else, and heaven forbid to my competitor, you know? What are the costs? So we have time measures and we have financial cost measures that we can attach to this qualitative measure. Did I get the product or service that I asked for? Now, I'll draw your attention to that very last line on this slide. Parts and services are products too. So when you put your expectations out there and when you asked for quality, you said, I want access to parts, I want access to service and or both, and I want them in this sort of availability and manner, and I want to receive things that aren't broken, and if I order a part, I want it to come ready to install. I don't want to have to put it back together because it was crushed in shipping or whatever it might have been, right? I don't want to have to teach your service people how to behave in the organization. I don't want to have to teach your people how to do an implementation, right? These are areas that you should use the same sort of measures on. Were you sold a concept of parts acquisition or parts accessibility and or service accessibility that said, we're as good as everybody else, or we're advanced and here's why? Did you get that? And here's why, right? So don't forget that it's not just the medical device itself, it is the parts and services that are wrapped around it as well, which leads us to measuring the quality of our vendors and suppliers. And again, I don't want to imply that vendors or suppliers, one is better than the other. We need the right complement of both. So it's important to make sure that we've been very thoughtful, like we described before, that I understand, am I measuring the quality of a vendor who I have transactional interactions with, and I have a certain quality of expediency and efficiency and accuracy and whatnot in those transactions that I want to monitor? Or is it a supplier where it's more strategic? I may spend more time talking to them about the characteristics on this slide than I do my vendor, but maybe not. Again, back to some of the experiences we've had in the last 10 months. I may want to dig deeper into their design and manufacturing quality. Are they using, can they describe to me that environment, their design and manufacturing environment, in terms of its mainstream, or is it obsolete, right? Are they operating in the 1950s, right? Are they using current technology, or are they really pushing the envelope in their design and manufacturing and looking for advanced, cutting edge sort of ways to stay in touch with our needs, but also to make sure they're designing and manufacturing high quality products? I'll share with you an anecdotal comment, I should put it that way. Several years back, I was in conversations with a major supplier who was behaving more like a vendor, being very transactional, reminded them that they were engaged with us as a supplier. And it was around quality conversations. And this supplier said to me, a very senior person in the organization said to me, actually to the group that was in the room, quality is very important to us. Quality is important all the way to our dock. Well, those of you that know me can probably anticipate what I said, which was almost immediately, could not stop the comment. What about my dock, right? What happens, where is your partnering with me to get it from your dock? Because I expect it to be high quality when it's sitting on your dock, but then it transitions to my dock, it goes into my delivery of care environment. I need you to be with me that whole journey, not just to when it leaves your dock on a truck or train or whatever. Things to keep in mind. And that actually takes us to, do you understand how the product gets to you, right? Is it direct from that manufacturer, or are there distributors? Are those distributors national? Are they regional? Are they local? What's their relationship with the manufacturer, if any, right? Where's the accountability when you try to follow up on any of these measures? And then support. These are things we talk about all the time: training, education, case support during procedures, and then certainly the ongoing maintenance support. How do they engage? This is sort of similar to design and manufacturing. Are they sort of mainstream? They show up, they're fairly consistent, whatnot, but they don't do anything special? Or have they really tweaked their business model, their operating model to say, this is important, the support part is a very important part of our business, and here's what we do that differentiates us, that puts us on a higher tier, if you will, or should put us on a higher tier, because we do this for you as a healthcare organization. You need to measure all those things, and qualitatively and quantitatively. So this brings me back to the call for action, or call to action, which is, please don't just expect quality to happen, ask for it. But why should you, as the HTM community, take this call to action to heart? I believe there's at least 3 good reasons for this to be important to you. One, influence. Your ability to influence positive outcomes in your organization, whether it's the prioritization of capital spending, the management of the costs around ownership of these technologies, is dramatically increased if you are talking in terms of not just technical aspects, but also quality, and that you can measure these. This also gives you another language and another channel of communication with those vendors and suppliers, to collaborate with them, to drive greater value. If you're informed, you are a valued resource to suppliers and vendors. If you're informed, if you're thinking about quality, the ones that really matter are going to latch onto you, because they get it. They see that this is the place they can differentiate themselves, and that they'll appreciate. They may whine, but they'll appreciate the fact that you hold them to those quality measures. And then your executives, the people you work for in your healthcare organization, are going to see that you are able to understand the bigger picture of your organization, and not just chasing electrons, if you will, not just fixing stuff in the basement, because we do so much more. But this gives us a language to communicate some of that so much more that we do in a manner that the executives understand and can consume and can apply to the work they need to do as well, the decisions they need to make. And then from a very practical perspective, you can align resources, your own staff, you know where to focus, and you know where you've got a vendor or a supplier that has your back and is behaving in a very quality manner with quality products. And it helps you collaborate more with your supply chain colleagues through that whole RFI, RFP, RFQ process, and then the ongoing monitoring and management of those relationships, not just management of the devices. And then certainly clinicians are able to do their jobs. If we do our jobs with our teammates in supply chain and finance, then our clinician colleagues can do their job at the bedside and know that they're going to have the products and services available to them in a timely manner and not delay and upend their processes, which are at the end of the day what the reason we're all in this business to begin with. So with that, I am going to turn it back to Gina and Colleen for questions.
So, Carol, thank you very much for the informative presentation. I do have a question for you before we turn it over to others. I'd like to know what happens when you don't get quality, when you don't get what you're expecting?
That's a great question, and unfortunately it happens all too often. I think a number of things can happen. One thing that happens is, unfortunately, nothing. We get aggravated in the healthcare delivery organization, in clinical engineering or biomed, or we get aggravated in supply chain, but we don't do anything about it. We sort of complain about it and we don't do anything about it. What, in my opinion, should happen is we should have that data. We should have been monitoring this data, and sometimes sometimes circumstances are such we do not see things coming, right? We could not have been monitoring our quality data in 2019 and known that there was a pandemic coming in 2020. We should, however, have an indication, though, and a good sense of who our vendors are, who our suppliers are, and their current level of quality, so that we can take note when things change. We should be able to note that we are not getting quality in subtle ways by watching our data before it's catastrophic, and that's the ideal. But if it's catastrophic, it is. And so the next step is that you lean into that relationship you have with the supplier or vendor in question, and you have a very candid conversation about this. How do we solve this, right? Because 9 times out of 10, there's problems on both sides. Or there are things that the supplier is going to need your help on to solve, and if only to set priorities, like the circumstances we're in now. There's only so much that can be produced. What's your priority? Do you want this thing or that thing first? I'm working on all of it, but which do you want first? So it really does become a collaborative conversation, and a true partnering conversation that you may need to have with that supplier or vendor. Great question. Colleen, do we have other questions? Or Gina, do we have other questions?
Yes, at this time, to all of our guests, you can simply submit any questions using the question section of your control panel, and we'll take a few minutes to answer the questions. We'll give them time to come to the queue. I do see one that's already come through. One came through early on. There was a question about recording, and yes, the session is recorded and all registrants will receive access to that recording. The next one, though, that I'd like to tee up to you guys, Gina and Carol, when you're considered a supplier/strategic partner with a business partner, why would that business partner compare your company to a vendor based only on lower pricing? Where's the quality commitment from the business partner to value the supplier commitment?
Well,
I think you were kind of splitting the two earlier.
Yeah. So there's a lot to unpack there. So it's important to understand the difference between a supplier and a vendor, only so that you set appropriate expectations. So I think Gina may be able to share some of the interesting things that PartSource is doing, because as you guys know, PartSource has to do the same sort of activity for their company, evaluate vendors and products. And you need to understand that, am I just in a transactional versus a more strategic? And you define that. And you can actually, you can request any provider, any manufacturer or distributor to behave in one or the other ways. It's a strategic decision you make in your organization, and you're setting expectations, right? You're setting expectations about that interaction, and you're putting out or you're documenting what those expectations are and how you're going to measure them, and then holding them accountable to that behavior. And so it's not saying that one is better than the other. It's just the way you interact with things. And maybe thinking about it in your own personal life. If you're buying an automobile and you just want to buy something to get you from point A to point B, and you're not looking for service support, you're not, you just want to put gas in it and go, right? That's a transaction. You're going to pay somebody some cash for this automobile to drive you from point A to point B. It's a commodity, right? If you're buying a vehicle that is going to be perhaps to run your small business, if you're a small business owner, and you need, so like I have a friend who does, he installs equipment and teaches people how to do automotive repair all over the Southwest. And so he has a vehicle that has to be outfitted in a certain way to carry certain products, to carry certain tools, to travel over extreme distances. And if there is a problem, he needs to know that he has somebody to go to on a moment's notice to get him out of trouble if that's the situation. So he has a much more in-depth, deeper strategic organization. He needs a partner that wants his success as much as their own, right? And so it's all about measuring that, that performance of those behaviors. I hope I answered that question. Do you want to add anything to that?
Let me jump in there a little bit. To your point, it all is about the partnership. And for us, our quality mission is about establishing and maintaining high quality standards to ensure our customer satisfaction and drive continuous improvement. And we do that by our active quality management approach. We have the approach where we're looking at people, process, and technology to make sure that we're driving quality throughout our suppliers, our services, throughout the whole supply chain, and we measure that. We're measuring it continuously to ensure that no matter what the customer selects, quality is not something that they have to not count on. You know what I mean? It's something that we have built into every single supplier, every single vendor, every single service. Quality is the first thing that we expect to be delivered, and we measure that on a continuum to ensure that that's what our customers are getting, the quality that they expect.
And so Gina, to sort of dig a little deeper, that quality is probably measured. I think about when I was in a manager role in a hospital. Your measures are probably similar to mine, which were: did you send me what I asked for? Was it in good condition when I received it?
Yep.
Did you bill me for what we did, for the agreed price, or were there additional costs that suddenly appeared? I mean, I'm assuming, and many, many more, but I'm assuming that's sort of, when you and I talk about quality measures, those are probably very more tangible sort of examples. Is that right?
Correct. And to your point, those are all tangible measurements that we ensure that we're hitting on from a company perspective, right? We track that and make sure that we're delivering upon each one of those measurements to the customer base.
That's
okay,
great.
hopefully we answered that. Any more questions, Colleen?
We do. We have another one from a gentleman named David. He says, we are stuck in a contract we were not involved with negotiating with a major supplier that provides a decent product but terrible technical support. I'm constantly trying to hold the supplier accountable. They make promises and rarely follow through. We're heavily involved with their product before tech support issues became apparent. Any suggestions?
Yeah, absolutely. If you do not already have a relationship, a working relationship with your supply chain colleagues, you better get on it. And not just the gentleman that just asked this question, but everybody listening. If you do not have a relationship with your supply chain management team, you better go get one right now. Start building that relationship. And the reason I say that is we can all make promises, and in our personal lives, we try to live into them the best we can. You know, our word is, you know, our honor, if you will. In business, we would hope that people would honor their word, but the best way to make sure that happens is in the contractual relationship, right? Because sometimes the people that we interact with in the moment, on the ground, for these technical or clinical sort of problems, do not have the authority to make decisions that they're committing to, right? How often have you heard that, right? You don't have the authority to make that decision. We've all heard that a lot. Well, those folks get the same response. Wow, you don't have the authority to have made that commitment. However, if you're in your partnership with your supply chain folks, this is a real problem. Your supply chain folks should have something that's called a vendor management program. And it's really what Gina and I were just talking about, which is you set expectations, you document expectations of behaviors and performance of both the product, the service, and the provider, if you will, the supplier / vendor. And then you monitor and measure it with all that data that we talked about. And when they're on a quarter, usually these are usually quarterly type meetings. And there are a couple of different names are applied to it, but basically it's a vendor management meeting where you and typically supply chain sits down with the vendor or supplier and talks about what's going well and what's not going well and what's the next thing, you know, what's out on the horizon. You need to provide that feedback to supply chain and get involved in that part of the process to provide that feedback. And not just this is a problem, but dig into your data and provide the supporting evidence, if you will, of what's happening qualitatively and quantitatively, like we were just talking about. It may take a few bites at the apple, as they say, but be persistent, but be prepared.
Great. We've got another one. You can definitely get answered. And if anybody else has questions, please go ahead and pop those in that Q&A portion of your control panel. So the next one says, arguably, medical device suppliers that do not offer service documentation, service training, access to parts, et cetera, are not providing quality. Talk about how to deal with suppliers like this. Similar, I guess, as before.
Yeah, it's a very similar situation, although I would go even further upstream in the process. So when we were talking about the acquisition process, the very first step is defining the strategy inside your healthcare delivery organization. Pardon me. And that includes not only the clinical things you're trying to do, but how are you going to support and maintain the technology, whatever it might be, both technically and financially. And you need to be involved and ask the tough questions at the table about what is your organization willing to set as an expectation, right? It has to be built in at the very beginning that your organization says that those things, service documentation, training, parts, whatever it might be, is strategically important. And then when you move into the value analysis or that sort of that move, that strategically tactical move, where you begin drafting and writing down the expectations, the clinical ones, the technical ones, the financial ones, you need to make sure it's in there that says this is our expectation around parts, service, documentation, access, whatever it might be. And then in the value analysis part, when you decide which are the deal breakers, that's where you have to make as a healthcare organization, this isn't on the supplier or vendor, remember, they've said, here's what I'm willing to do, right? You as the healthcare organization, what my saying often is, we have to be willing to put our wallet back in our pocket or our purse, right? And say, I'm not going to buy from you if you cannot meet these deal breaker requirements. Some are clinical, some are technical, some are financial, some of them are a little all of the above, right? But it's the healthcare organization that has to have the courage, quite frankly, to say, I'm not going to buy from you, even though you have a product that is pretty sweet. I'm not going to buy from you because you're not engaging in a relationship that benefits me for the long term. And I need it to be a long-term strategic relationship. It sounds like in your particular case that may not have happened, or your organization may have said strategically, that was not a deal breaker for us. And then it's incumbent on the HTM professional, excuse me, to then go back to your data and pull that data and tell a compelling story about why it could or should be strategically important to the organization, not just to you and your department. And can sometimes be a tough task to take on.
Agreed. Well, thank you, Carol and Gina. We have no more questions in the queue. So I'd like to thank Carol, Gina, and all of you who have attended today for your time. As a reminder, you'll receive a follow-up email that includes a link to the recording. That email will be coming within 2 to 3 business days via email, if not sooner. Be sure to join us next Thursday as the HTM Leadership Series continues with our virtual PartSource Partners Symposium, which will feature speakers from Mayo Clinic, Intermountain Healthcare, McLaren Healthcare, Siemens Healthcare, Midmark, Triplite, and more. At this time, today's webcast is ended. Thank you for attending and have a wonderful day.